Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about chapter 3, which is cell structure and function. We're going to be discussing the two different types of cells, what's different, what's similar between the two types, and we're also going to be talking about the different organelles that you find within those cells. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started. So the learning outcomes for this chapter is we're going to state the basic principles of the cell theory, what are the two major cell types, what are the different organelles, and what is their function. Well, the cell theory states the cell is the basic unit of life, and all living things are made out of cells, and new cells arise only from pre-existing cells. So here we have different organisms that are made out of different cells. Some of them are unicellular, which means that they're only made of only one cell, whereas other organisms, just plants such as humans, they're made out of many cells, so they're multicellular organisms. So as you can see, there's a whole diversity when it comes to the different types of cells, and they perform different functions. So there are two major cell types, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells, they lack internal membrane-bound organelles, whereas eukaryotic cells, they have membrane-bound organelles, including a nucleus. So there's also similarities between the two of them and also differences. And later we'll talk about the similarities and the differences between the two types of cells. So let's talk about the similarities between the prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So they both have a cell membrane that is made of phospholipids, which is basically a type of fat, and it also has proteins as well. They both have a cytoplasm, which is the gelatinous aqueous interior. They both have ribosomes, which is basically a complex of RNA and proteins that carry out protein synthesis. So ribosomes are basically a complex of proteins, and their function is to make other proteins. Now, it is extremely important to understand that the ribosomes that are found in prokaryotic cells are different than the ribosomes that are found in eukaryotic cells. And later when we talk about protein synthesis, we'll talk about the differences. They both have DNA as a molecule of heredity. Now, it's also extremely important to mention that the location where the DNA is found is different between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So let's talk about some of the differences between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. Only eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, and within the nucleus you actually find the DNA. So if you are looking at a cell under the microscope and you see the presence of a nucleus, that should tell you that what you're looking at is a eukaryotic cell. In addition, eukaryotic cells have many organelles, and these organelles do different functions. And later we'll talk about the specific organelles and what is their function. Only prokaryotic cells have their DNA floating in the cytoplasm. So prokaryotic cells also have DNA, however the DNA is just floating in the cytoplasm. Prokaryotic cells, they do not have organelles. Now, in addition, prokaryotic cells actually have a cell wall. And the function of a cell wall is to provide an extra layer of protection to prokaryotic cells. And later when we talk about antibiotics, we'll come back to discussing about the cell wall, because the way antibiotics work is that they actually target the cell wall. Let's talk about the cell membrane. All cells, both prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, have a cell membrane. A cell membrane is composed of a phospholipid bilayer, which means that it's two layers of fat, if you will. And in this phospholipid bilayer, you actually have proteins that are embedded. The cell membrane is what we call semi-permeable, which means that certain things can go in and out of the cell. When we talk about the phospholipid bilayer, it's composed of a head that has a charge. So that head actually interacts with water. So we say that it's hydrophilic, which means that it's water-loving. Now it also has a long tail. The long tail is made out of a bunch of carbon-to-carbon bonds, and carbon is a neutral element. So carbon is facing away from the water, so we say that it's hydrophobic, which means that it doesn't like water, it's afraid of water, if you will. Now, because it has two layers of phospholipids, then you also have the opposite as well. So the inside of the cell, you actually have water. And so what happens is that the phospholipids are inverted. So the head is actually facing towards the water, and the tail is actually facing towards the tail of the opposite phospholipid. The cell membrane is composed of two layers of very special fats that we call phospholipids. So let's talk about the structure of the phospholipids. So the phospholipid has a head, and this head has a charge. Now this head is facing towards the outside of the cell. So the cell is surrounded by water. So the head of the phospholipid is what we call hydrophilic, which means that it's water loving, which means that it likes to interact with water. Now it also has a long tail, and this tail is made out of a bunch of carbon-to-carbon-to-carbon-to-carbon bonds. Carbon is a neutral element. So the tail of the phospholipid is what we call hydrophobic, which means that it doesn't like water. Now towards the inside of the cell, it's also surrounded by water as well. And so what happens here is that the phospholipids are facing the opposite. So the head is facing towards the inside of the cell, because remember, it's hydrophilic, which means that it loves water. And then the tail is facing towards the other tail of the other phospholipid, which means, and remember, it's hydrophobic. Now this gives the cell membrane different properties, such as, for example, it allows certain things to just cross the membranes, very small molecules, uncharged molecules. But if you're a bigger molecule, such as a glucose, if you're a charged molecule, you cannot go through the membrane. However, in the membrane, we also have proteins. And those proteins serve this purpose of allowing bigger molecules, such as glucoses, or charged molecules to actually cross the membrane. And so this is what we call that the cell membrane is semi-permeable. Certain molecules can just diffuse right through the membrane. So small uncharged molecules, such as, for example, oxygen, can just go right through the membrane. However, if you are a bigger molecule, such as a glucose, or if you're a molecule that has a charge, such as sodium, you cannot cross the cell membrane. And the reason for that is because of the phospholipids. Remember, the tail, it's hydrophobic, right? It doesn't have a charge. However, we have proteins, and the purpose of those proteins is to allow bigger molecules such as glucose or charged molecules to actually cross the cell membrane. So let's talk about more how molecules can actually cross the cell membrane. So simple diffusion is the natural tendency of the cell substances to move from an area where there's lots of them to an area where there's less of them. Now, small molecules, such as, for example, oxygen, can just diffuse right through the membrane. So if there's lots of oxygen on the inside, what happens is that there's a pressure for those molecules to actually go inside of the cell. And so if you're a small molecule such as oxygen, you can just diffuse right through the membrane. Now, the other important part about simple diffusion is that it doesn't require the assistance of proteins, and it doesn't require energy. And the reason why it doesn't require energy is because you're going from an area where there's lots of them to an area where there's less of them. Now, if you're a bigger molecule such as glucose, or if you're a molecule that has a charge, you cannot just diffuse right through the membrane. You need the assistance of proteins. So transport proteins, they basically sit in the membrane bilayer. They act as a channel, a carrier, or a pump. They provide a pathway for those bigger molecules to actually cross the cell membrane. They can move substances with or against the concentration gradient. So let's talk more about those transport proteins.